It's good to be here again with you tonight. Today is February the 21st, 2023, and I've been driving around the last few days seeing these fields of white blossoms. And normally when you see these almond orchards all in full bloom, you're thinking, well, some 70, 75 degree weather is right around the corner. We usually have a few of those toward the end of February. But this year has decided to be obstinate, different, and it's going to turn off winter again, sounds like, over the next week. Lots of rain and snow and wind and cold. So today, this is session number 22, and the handout that you have tonight, you'll notice it's in 3 columns. And what we did last session, we compared the similarities between Matthew 24 and 2 Thessalonians 2. And we said Paul must have done a Bible study on Matthew 24, or at the very least, because Matthew 24, as we know it, probably was not written yet in complete book form as we have it in our Bibles today. But no doubt what Jesus taught in Matthew 24 was well known. Many probably had written down parts or all of it, especially the disciples who were there. And at least verbally, it was a very well-known teaching in the early church. So I enjoyed putting that together. And what we have in this handout is a 3rd column. It's actually the 1st column on this. But I've done the same thing with the book of Daniel. So we're comparing Daniel, Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians 2. And I've never seen anything quite like this. I don't know if you have. So it's kind of a new effort for me to look at the structure of Matthew 24 and what are the main subjects in that chapter. The same thing with 2 Thessalonians 2 and the same thing with Daniel. And what I discovered is nothing earth-shattering other than it appears they had the same Holy Spirit directing them. Can you believe that? And it appears that they shared the same blueprint because they each deal with the same subjects. And one of the purposes of going through this exercise is what I brought up last time. I'm trying to take what many people consider the core parts of the Bible that deal with the end times. Daniel, Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians 2. And now I'm in the process, probably next session, of having a 4-column handout and having the last column be the book of Revelation. And so by the time we get through with this exercise, we're going to see that the main parts of the Bible that talk about the end times share the same blueprint. They emphasize the same subjects. They speak the same language. They use the same terminology. They're trying to tell us these are the important parts of this subject. And they're all borrowing language from each other. They're all quoting each other. They're all referring to each other. They're all basically saying the same things in slightly different language, but close enough to where we know they are familiar with each other's writings and they are kind of putting it in their own words, but they're saying the same things. So the reason for going through this exercise is being able to see there's a framework that they're all using to lay out these major events leading up to the return of Christ. So I'm building a case for that. And so I've never done quite this kind of thing before, but it's been helpful for me. Just in 3 columns, you can see where they're all sharing the same ideas and the same important events as each other. So one reason I wanted to add Daniel is because you'll see I have in this handout Daniel underlined as source for, and then I put the arrows toward Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians 2. Daniel is a source for Jesus and Paul to use in their writings. So when Jesus said go to Daniel in 24:15, he wasn't saying it for unimportant reasons or for just a little bit of information. Go over to Daniel. What he's actually saying in 24:15 is regarding the abomination of desolation, and by extension regarding the Antichrist. Because one of the interesting things in Matthew 24, here's Jesus. You think he more than Paul and Daniel, but it's actually less than. You read through Matthew 24, and he hardly says anything about the Antichrist, his rival, his enemy, the false Messiah. He hardly deals with that man at all. He leaves it up to Daniel and Paul. So when you go over to 2 Thessalonians 2, in that column, I say at the very bottom, Paul not only did a Bible study of Matthew 24, he did as Jesus told us to do. He went to Daniel. And what you find in 2 Thessalonians 2 is he deals a lot with Antichrist, more than Jesus does in Matthew 24, but not as much as Daniel does in his writings. So what really is standing out to me as I'm going through this effort of putting them in columns side by side, and each number dealing with the same subtopic or subject, subpart of the overall subject, is that they're all dealing with similar subjects, but each of them emphasizes a different part. Like Daniel and Paul emphasize the Antichrist. Jesus does not. But Jesus highlights his return in ways that Daniel does not. So it's kind of like they're talking about the same subjects, but they're putting the emphasis on different ones of them from the other writer. And I find that pretty fascinating. So when Jesus said in 24:15 of Matthew, go to Daniel, one of the reasons I think he said that is to get across the idea that what I'm bringing out to my disciples is really just a continuation of what the earlier prophets wrote about. I'm just kind of picking and choosing different passages from the Old Testament prophets because I'm the one who directed them to write what they wrote. So I'm going to just kind of take parts of each of them, put them together, and call it Matthew 24, even though he wouldn't call it that, but that's what it ended up being called. And if you want to know more about the abomination of desolation and the Antichrist, go to Daniel, because I'm not going to take the time right now, because it's already there for you to go read. But what Paul did then later in 2 Thessalonians 2 is to take Matthew 24 and Daniel, kind of blend them together. And that's what you have in 2 Thessalonians 2. So last session, we compared the similarities of Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians 2. But what I'd like to do tonight is do the same thing, only spend our time mostly in Daniel and see how he develops those same 7 main points I have laid out here. And the first one that we looked at last session in Matthew and in Paul was the parousia, the coming, the arrival, the presence of Jesus. And so we looked at those verses in Matthew and in Paul. But tonight I'd like to look at that same part of the overall topic, the coming of Christ, in Daniel. And one thing that kind of stood out to me as you turn over to Daniel chapter 2, we'll read some verses there, is that at first glance, the book of Daniel doesn't seem right. And by that I mean he spends a lot more time discussing the Antichrist than he does the coming of Christ. That just seems backwards to me at first glance. But Jesus, knowing that, that's one of the reasons he said, go to Daniel, because if you want to know a lot more about the Antichrist, that's where it is. So when you look for the actual coming of Christ, he's dealing with empires, he's dealing with dictators, he's dealing with conquering kings, he's dealing with all these big visions and dreams and their interpretation. He's a high-up administrator in 2 great empires. But then you get into the later chapters, and we went through this a few sessions ago in chapter 11. He spends a large part of that whole long chapter, 45 verses, detailing the Antichrist. He doesn't do anything like that, detailing Christ and the return of Christ. So it's like they're all playing tag team. It's almost like when the Spirit led Daniel to write his book, he already knew Jesus and Paul and John in Revelation, they'll end up giving a lot of the details about the return of Christ. We'll let Daniel highlight the Antichrist and the Gentile empires and the wicked nations and how God is going to judge them and set up his glorious kingdom. But he leaves it up to later writers to actually emphasize the return of Christ. All of this, as I'm putting all this together, it's just, again, like I said last week, the more detail I get into by comparing these different books and chapters and how they deal with similar subjects, it's actually simplifying the whole thing to me. Because it's something like this, and I know, again, you look at 3 columns, there's numbers and verses and everything, and at first glance you think, boy, this is kind of complicated. But as we go through each column, you realize, no, it's actually pretty simple. 7 main points about the return of Christ. Each of them have something to say about it. You put all 3 together in columns and you realize, hey, they're on the same page, led by the same Spirit. So here at Daniel, the coming of Christ, here's how he describes it. And he doesn't even mention Jesus by name as we would think. He uses a type or an inanimate object that's real common in the Bible, used of God and of Jesus, a rock and a stone. So in 2:34, Daniel is telling Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands. I mean, that just draws a picture itself, doesn't it? A stone, how can a stone be cut without hands? And what's a stone doing in heaven? You don't think of like rocks and stones and things like that being in heaven. A stone was cut without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay. So that tells us God is waiting, and we'll get into these in future sessions. This is a really important idea. Why does God allow evil to continue like he is. Not just continue, but build. I mean, evil and deception, as we'll get into here, is building day by day in our time. Why is God allowing it? Why doesn't he put a stop to it? It's ruining families, ruining churches, ruining individual people's lives, ruining countries. Why does he allow that? He has a reason. And Daniel speaks a lot about that. He's in this idea in verse 34, God waits until this whole image gets down to its feet and toes. So God knew ahead of time that many centuries, many empires, many wars, the slaughter of thousands, millions of people, the subjugation, imprisonment, slavery of millions of people as these different empires rise, conquer each other, control for hundreds of years. Then they get conquered and another one comes along. The devastation, the ruination of families, countries, individuals who all they want to do is stay home with their mom and dad and help on the farm. But then horses show up one day and say, you got 3 sons, we're taking 2 of them, and you have no choice in the matter. We're off to fight a war. And chances are you'll probably never see them again. How many times has that story been repeated down through history? And yet, God has a purpose of letting all of this develop to a place on this image, its feet of iron and clay, before he sends that stone made without hands. Why does he let all of that develop over the course of many centuries? So much damage, so much evil. But he purposely waits till the image is complete, it's standing, and it's down to its toes, and then he sends that stone. These are the ways of God that we don't understand, but he does have a purpose in it. Verse 35, then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. I mean, not just crushed, but forgotten, gone, invisible, completely destroyed. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So that's how God leads Daniel to describe the return of Christ. And you won't read this description in Jesus, Paul, maybe a little bit in Revelation, but not quite this image. This is one that is reserved for Daniel. And it draws a picture that none of the other descriptions draw, does it? I mean, you just see this big old stone coming down, hitting this image on its feet, and the whole image crumbles and the wind blows it away. It's such a visual, dramatic way of describing the return of Christ. You think, well, that's why he doesn't have to spend a lot of time in the book of Daniel describing the return of Christ, because these 2 verses tell a whole story of the entire history of Gentile kingdoms and the return of Christ and setting up of Christ's kingdom. It's like God only needed 2 verses to tell that whole story. Then, of course, down in verse 44 and 45, he explains what it means. In the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. The kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it, as opposed to the other kingdoms, shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands. So the stone is Christ, the mountain is his kingdom. Mountains in the Bible often are speaking about kingdoms, great powers. And that of broken pieces, the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain and its interpretation is sure, or in other words, this is exactly how the future is going to work itself out. And he's talking about empires that no one had even dreamed about yet. The Roman Empire? Who could even imagine such an empire? Alexander the Great and the Grecian Empire. Who could imagine such an empire? You know, they thought everything had to be like in Babylon or Assyria, maybe the Medes and Persians, you know, the Tigris, Euphrates, Mesopotamia area. That's where the great empires were. And so no one thought of like out there in the West, you know, this like barbarian pagan country out there. But God, through this dream, was saying, no, great empires are going to rise from areas you could not even dream about. And I'm going to come and destroy them. And then about the only other place the return of Christ is mentioned in Daniel is that familiar passage in chapter 7, verse 13 and 14. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man. And this can get quite detailed, but this part of the book of Daniel was not written in Hebrew. It was written in Aramaic. And that the reason that's important is because this is the only time the term Son of Man is used in the Old Testament in Aramaic. Now in Hebrew, you know, the book of Ezekiel talks about himself as a son of man. That just means human. But there's a reason why God selected in another language this term Son of Man to apply to his son. And most of you know that this is the description, the term that Jesus chose to use of himself. He used this of himself more than all the other terms we like to use about Christ combined. You know, Christ, Jesus, Savior, you know, whatever, Son of God. But when he's talking about himself, he almost always used Son of Man, because he's trying to reinforce, impress on their minds, I am that figure in Daniel 7:13. That's me. Coming with the clouds of heaven, and we know the cloud coming of Christ is a real common idea in the Bible, both Old and New Testament. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. So this is, in timing, this is really kind of describing right after his ascension, after his resurrection. When God said to him, Psalm 110, verse 1, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. So this is when the Son of Man is coming to the Ancient of Days after his ascension. But the extension of that idea is verse 14. To him was given, because of his death, resurrection, and ascension, the kingdom that he will set up at his return was guaranteed. And so it's spoken of as if it happened at that point, but it actually comes to pass at his return in fullness. To him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, languages should serve him. His dominion is everlasting dominion, shall not pass away. His kingdom, the one which shall not be destroyed. So, okay, a few verses in Daniel 2, a few verses in Daniel 7, you think that's not much about such an important event like the return of Christ in this whole big book that's talking a lot about the end times. And yet you take that one idea from chapter 2, Jesus as rock, and from Daniel 7, Jesus as Son of Man. It's all over the place in the New Testament, those two ideas. Son of Man in the Gospels, stone and rock. You know, the rock that followed them was Christ. He is the cornerstone, the sure foundation stone. On and on and on throughout the rest of the Bible. He's referred to as a stone and a rock. So it's huge ideas from just a few verses in the book of Daniel, the coming of Christ. Daniel also does what Jesus and Paul did, highlights deception as a key warning. So let's look at these verses. They're quite interesting. Daniel 8:23. In the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness. See, we're going to be coming back to this idea in the future. When the transgressors have reached their fullness. Jesus talked about, and Paul talked about, the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled, the fullness of the Gentiles. 2 Thessalonians 2 really is talking about the fullness of the mystery of iniquity. And that speaks back to Daniel 2. Why does God wait for all those empires to do all their conquering and destruction before he sends that stone, hits it on its toes and feet? This answers part of that. He's waiting for the transgressors to reach their fullness. God has a purpose in allowing evil to progress and grow. Just like he told Abraham, or Abram at the time, back in chapter 15 of Genesis, I'm going to take your seed out of this land, the promised land. I'm going to take them to Egypt. He didn't name Egypt, but he said to a place that's not theirs, and they're going to become enslaved, afflicted for 400 years. And one of the reasons he gives for taking them out of the land for so long, before bringing them back, he said, until the iniquity of the Amorites is complete. So that when I bring you back here under Joshua, I am completely justified in wiping them out. Men, women, children, everything. Because their iniquity will become so great that they will have no redeeming qualities left. And they deserve to be wiped out. It's that same principle, I think, that's being carried over into the end times. I'm waiting for evil with the man of sin and Satan cast out to the earth, incarnating him and directing him. I'm allowing all that to reach its greatest point of evil before I step in. These are just some of the ways of God that are difficult to accept because of our humanness. But so anyway, in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. Now, depending on what translation you're using, it may word it a little different. But I wanted to include this verse because it's describing deception without using the word deception. Sinister schemes, fierce features, transgression reaching its fullness. All this is describing what the New Testament calls deception. And then in 11:23, it does use the word deception. And this is mostly a whole chapter talking about him. 11:23, after the league is made, that's the covenant that the 70 weeks talks about. After the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully. So in other words, as soon as the peace treaty is signed, he's going to start trying to figure out a way out of it, around it. He's going to be working behind the scenes to deceive the nations so that he can justify breaking it in the middle of the 7 years. And then, if we go back to chapter 8, and I wanted to, maybe Sister Ruth, you're using the New American Standard, I believe. And back in chapter 8, verse 25, I make a note on the handout under 8:25, under point 2, deception, a key warning. I said it really helps to do a word study and comparison in translations, such as the King James Version. And I say that because 825 in the King James, or the old King James version, says just the first part of a sentence. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. Now, what would you think that means in modern day English? So it's kind of confusing, huh? Because the meaning of words have changed. You'd almost think that he shall cause craft to prosper means he's going to cause builders, architects, craftspeople to prosper. That's not, the word craft there is really the idea of craftiness. It's not craft like a trade. It's craft like deceitful, being crafty, being deceitful. So 825 in the New King James says, through his cunning, instead of policy, it's cunning. Through his cunning, he shall cause deceit to prosper. See, that makes sense. It's easy to understand. The old King James makes it a little difficult, so we don't want to say anything negative about the old King James. It's a great translation and all that, but words change their meaning, and something like this makes it a little difficult to understand. How does the New American Standard say that first part?
It says, through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence.
See, I like that real well. That's real clear. Shrewdness. Not just craftiness, not just trickery, but he's shrewd. It had a little different implication in the meaning of words. So we already read in Jesus and Paul the deception verses. I don't want to go over those again tonight, other than just to show a comparison of all three places, emphasizing deception as a key warning. Now, apostasy. I need to move along a little quicker. Now, this is another one where Jesus in Matthew 24 and Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2 really hit hard on this idea of apostasy, this falling away. But Daniel, not so much. About the only place he refers to it, kind of in an indirect way almost, is chapter 11, verse 32 through 34. And he says, those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery. Could you read that first sentence in the New American Standard?
By smooth words, he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant.
Okay, so it's really describing the apostasy just in different language, that he's going to use his cunning, his craftiness, his shrewdness to deceive a lot of people who will believe the lie instead of the truth. And that's much of what the apostasy is. And so that's kind of the only place he refers to that idea. The people who know their God shall be strong, carry out great exploits. And those of the people who understand shall instruct many, yet for many days they shall fall by sword, flame, and by captivity and plundering. Now, when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join them by intrigue. So maybe some of those who fall away will actually use that to come back in as spies or as infiltrators. And God's people won't really recognize them as having fallen away. They won't, have seen it or heard it or whatever, and they'll allow them kind of to come back in among them, and they will be spies for the government, for the Antichrist. And we're already seeing that to some degree now. If you see something, say something. Those kind of things during COVID, and tattle on each other, report your neighbor to your government kind of ideas, building. But so the idea of falling away is not really highlighted, just kind of in passing or indirect way in Daniel. But I am glad for the wording, like in verse 33 and 34, it does speak about those who will fall. So there's going to be two falls, isn't there? There's going to be a falling away and a falling in death as martyrs. So I like to read these kind of verses, like if I'm, preaching a sermon, especially if you're appealing to people to repent and give their lives to the Lord, is everyone's going to fall. You're either going to fall away from the Lord or you're going to fall in death. You're going to fall into prison or something like that. There's two different fallings that the Bible talks about during that time. One will be for your eternal benefit if you fall away in death, for standing for the truth. If you fall away from the truth, it will not be to your eternal benefit. But you're going to fall one way or the other, probably. The abomination of desolation, we've looked at these in past sessions, so I won't take the time to read all of these in Daniel. But I do want to notice some of the wording. For instance, in 1131, look at the action words. 1131, forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place. See that action word, place, there, the abomination of desolation. So the abomination of desolation is going to be placed in the sanctuary. But you look at the verses in Matthew 24, when you see the abomination of desolation standing. And then Paul, when he brings up this subject, sitting in the temple, declaring himself to be God. So he's placed, he's standing, he's sitting. And then in 12:11 of Daniel, it uses a little different action word idea. From the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, the abomination is set up. So it's placed, it's set up, it stands, it sits. So it's kind of that's why I've said it's kind of the person of the Antichrist. I think he literally does go in and declare himself as God. So he's standing literally. He's sitting literally. I think that's what picture is trying to draw, is that it's a man going in there, standing and sitting. But then it also has the idea the abomination is placed and it's set up. So I think that's where the idea of, because that's all in the middle of the 7 years, and that seems to be when the false prophet makes an image of the beast and causes the image to speak and causes people to worship the image. So there's the man, and then there's the image of the man. So that's how you can use the words stand and sit. You can use the words placed and set up, because I think it's both the man and the image of the man. That was kind of fascinating to me to see those different action words used by Daniel, Jesus, and Paul to be able to draw a full picture, a whole picture of maybe what happens. Now, I make a point in the second column, Matthew 24, and this point 4, under Mark 13:14. I say this is as close to mentioning Antichrist as Jesus gets in Matthew 24. So in verse 15, he says, when you see the abomination sitting or standing in the holy place, go to Daniel and you'll find out more. But then he just kind of moves on, because he already said, you'll find a lot of information about this over at Daniel, so I'm not even going to deal with it more here. And then he goes on. So here's Christ. Between Christ, Daniel, and Paul, Christ says the least about Antichrist. And you think he'd be the one that says the most. It's interesting. And then I give the verses in the first column where the Antichrist is mentioned in Daniel. So I don't want to be too confusing here, but under point 3 in Matthew for apostasy, Matthew 24, 10 through 12, the word many is used several times. And then Paul talks about the falling away. So Jesus and Paul are talking about the same thing, the apostasy. But then Jesus kind of, in 2 Thessalonians 2, 3, the falling away happens first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. So Paul goes right from the falling away to the man of sin. Jesus deals with the falling away, but really doesn't go on and deal with the second part of 2:3 of 2 Thessalonians. In other words, he leaves it up to Paul to bring up the man of sin is revealed. He has other things he wants to deal with in Matthew 24. It is just really becoming quite fascinating and beautiful to me how these three men, one divine and two almost divine, it seems like, Paul and Daniel, how they're like playing tag team with all these subjects. I'll let you emphasize that one. I'm going to emphasize something else. I'll let you emphasize that one. I'll emphasize something else. But we're all really saying the same things. We're just choosing different things to highlight. Point 5, the temple. And this is, I wanted to spend a few minutes on this. Let me see. I think we're fine. So in 9:26 of Daniel, Daniel mentions the sanctuary. Now, okay, 9:26. After the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. If you get into a discussion with anyone who knows a fair amount about the prophetic scriptures, the return of Christ, the end times, they'll either have a position that there are two princes, Messiah the prince, and that the people of the prince to come is the evil prince, the Antichrist. That's what I think. That's what I think most of us think. But a very large percentage of Bible teachers, end time teachers, and so forth, and even among our own people, I hear this brought up some. No, this is the same prince. Or they might make the prince to come like Titus in 70 AD. But they make usually just have the prince as Messiah only, because then as you go into verse 27, they make the he be Christ, not Antichrist. He shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. In the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And the idea is that that's what Christ did on the cross. He put an end to sacrifice and offering by his own death. There are many problems with that in my own mind. But those who hold that this is Christ, not Antichrist, then make the sanctuary, the temple, especially in 2 Thessalonians 2, not be a literal temple. There will not be a literal temple rebuilt. That the temple is the church, and it's not, and it has nothing to do with a literal temple and a man walking in there and stopping the sacrifice. So you're going to go one way or the other with these verses, but I take it to be, so that's why I make a footnote here on point 5. And I say, even though the temple had been destroyed and not rebuilt yet, Daniel looked for one in the future, more than one. And let me just clarify that. I also give 11:31, as he mentions the sanctuary with the idea of the abomination. So I would maybe put it this way. When Daniel received this vision and its interpretation to some degree, what did he have in mind as the sanctuary? I would say he had in mind a rebuilt temple. Because when he was in Babylon receiving these visions, the temple was destroyed. There was no temple. And yet he starts talking about all these promises and events that are connected to the sanctuary. What sanctuary? The Babylonians destroyed it. So he came to an understanding of a rebuilt temple. And very soon after this, 43,000 Jews returned from Babylon under Zerubbabel and Joshua, and they rebuilt the temple. But it wasn't rebuilt at this point. There was no temple, but he was speaking of a temple. That some things were going to happen. So Daniel, regarding the temple idea, the sanctuary idea, had only one thing in mind: a literal temple building. My footnote down at the bottom of the first column, since Paul was using Daniel and Jesus as guides, would he speak of a temple different than them in the same context? By that I mean, when Paul says that in 2:4 of 2 Thessalonians, he shall sit in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Many people say there's not a rebuilt temple. The temple is the church today, or whatever they make the temple today, and it's not a literal building that Paul was talking about. One of the benefits of doing these columns side by side under point 5 is Daniel. Is that blowing air now? It must be blowing air. I feel kind of cool air coming from that direction, warm air coming from this direction. So. Okay, I got this up to 70, so it should hold the room up to 70. So I don't mean to be going in circles other than just to say that one of the benefits of the side-by-side columns like this is that under point 5, Daniel was thinking of a literal temple. Jesus was thinking of a literal temple when he mentions standing in the holy place. What holy place was he thinking of? Well, let me read this. I've read this to you before, I think. Or I've said it in kind of similar ways. This man, P.S.G. Watson, wrote a book called The Prophetic Key. He was known as the father of Arkansas Baptists, lived almost 200 years ago, and he loved prophecy. And he asked the question, where then is the holy place to which the Lord refers to in Matthew 24:15? The following considerations may enable us to find the intended spot. Number 1, when Jesus spoke these words, he was on Mount Olivet with the Jewish temple in full view. Number 2, he had just been speaking of the temple, that not one stone would be left standing on top of another. Number 3, in the temple was one room called, quote, the holy place, and another called the most holy place. Number 4, Jesus and the disciples whom he was addressing knew well that those rooms were so named. Number 5, there is no just cause for rejecting the known literal holy place and hunting for an unknown figurative one that many people try to do in 2 Thessalonians 2. So I agree with Mr. Watson on that. So Paul is quoting or directly referencing or thinking of Daniel's writings about the sanctuary and Jesus' statement about the holy place in Matthew 24:15 when he wrote 2 Thessalonians 2 and spoke of this man sitting in the temple of God. Same temple. Okay. And number 6, the idea of the episunago in Matthew and Thessalonians. We went over that last session. It means to gather together. where does Daniel mention the gathering together of the saints? He doesn't mention it in that exact verbiage, but he does talk about the resurrection of the saints at the same time in 12:2, where he simply says, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. We find out in the New Testament there are two resurrections separated by 1,000 years. But Daniel doesn't go into that kind of detail here. The only thing I'd mention about this resurrection and the gathering of saints is in 12:1, it's immediately after the Great Tribulation of 12:1. There'll be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Number 7 is self-explanatory. We went over that in Matthew and Thessalonians last session, and Daniel's way of dealing with it is verses we already read tonight on point number 1, same verses in point number 7. He's coming. How do we know he's coming in power and great glory? He's that stone made without hands that strikes that image at its feet, causes it to crumble. And he's given that glorious kingdom in 7:14. And so those all line up together. I want to close by making one point clarification from last week. And I mentioned it here under point 6 in the last column on 1 Thessalonians 4. So let's just turn over there. We'll close with this before I open it up to you. 1 Thessalonians 4 is almost always the main passage people turn to when they're talking about the rapture, the resurrection, and the return of Christ. So we went over this last session, so I won't go into detail again, other than I did say that verse 17, we're caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And depending on if you're pre-tribulation or post-tribulation, it stops right there, doesn't it? If you're pre-tribulation, you're adding the words, and we turn around and go back to heaven for 7 years. But it doesn't say that, does it? We add that in there to fit our belief. But I also said by the same token, it also does not say we meet him in the air as he's coming to the earth and he keeps coming to the earth. Even though I believe that to be true, we shouldn't be guilty of the same thing, adding words when Jesus stopped or Paul stops at a certain point. But I would make one little technical point, and I put it down here on the handout. 1 Thessalonians 4:17, the word meet is the Greek word apentesis. I give you the Strong's number in case you want to study it. It is a word with a particular meaning. And it's the same word used in Acts 28:15 when Paul was on his way to Rome. And it says the brethren in Rome, he got to the place of the three taverns, I think it's called Appian Way. And it says the brethren came out to meet him. But did Paul turn around and go back, or did he stay there? No. He's on his way to Rome. He continued to Rome from the place they met him. So they came out to meet him, and they turned around and walked with him into Rome. It's exactly what that word meet means. 1 Thessalonians 4:17. We're meeting him as he's coming to the earth. And when we meet up with him, we just turn around and journey with him where his destination was all along, to come to the earth. That word meet carries that idea. It's very much like we say when someone, whoever it might be, is coming to our house. And then we look out and we see the car drive up. I'm going to go out and meet him. or meet them. What does that mean? Well, we go out to the car to meet them, and then we walk with them back into the house because that's where they were coming, is to our house, not to the driveway, or not to just stay out front. So you might just keep that in the back of your mind and do a little bit more study on that. But that word meet, at the very least, gives a strong indication that when we meet him in the air, we're not turning around and going back to heaven. We're meeting him on his way to the earth, and we're going to share the last part of that journey with him in glorified, resurrected bodies. So I think we'll stop there for the